All right, welcome to the users, groups, and permissions portion of the course. This is where we can actually start getting Active Directory up and working in terms of what it was intended to do all along. So this also means once we get done with this portion and get our group set up and user set up, we can actually convert those Windows clients that we did earlier in the course to proper enterprise Windows installs. So I'll show you how to do that in a different video. However, this is the last step before we can actually start using network resources properly. So let's go ahead and get into this one. General rules, general guidelines. Two big ones. One, rule least privilege. You don't want to give anyone more privilege than what they need. And this is to avoid users doing things with their privilege that they don't necessarily need to do, and it generally just causes headaches for you, the admin, and other system administrators as well. The other thing that we need to talk about is don't overthink it. So generally what ends up happening is if you have the general guidelines and general understanding of what Microsoft is intending Active Directory to be used as, you're going to be okay. A lot of the problems come when you think you have a better idea of how to do it, and then you run into an edge case, and then it doesn't work anymore, and then it gets messy very quickly, and then you lose track of what you're trying to do. All right, so it is very easy to do that with users and groups just because there's inheritance involved, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But in general, just follow the Microsoft guidelines. Make sure you're setting your permissions to the group, and then your users inside of that group are inheriting those permissions. So here we go. Users are entities in Active Directory. So this means that it could be a system process. It could be basically anything that you want to identify as something. So most of the time it's going to be a person, but it doesn't mean that it can't be any type of process that you're looking for. It just depends on what you're trying to do and how you're trying to organize your environment to be, essentially. I don't know how else to explain that, but typically speaking, if you're going to use a user as an entity, it's going to reveal itself that it needs to be that relatively easily, and should be obvious when that needs to happen. Okay, so moving on. Groups are a collection of users. Typically, these are people. Occasionally, it might be a group of specialized people, like an admin group, or in Linux, it would be a sudo group. Yeah, this is where most of your permissions are going to go, and the reason why we do it like this is because it's easier to manage. And what we mean by that is if you have an accounting department and there are 50 people, and you add another person, or you need to change all the permissions for that accounting group because they needed resources on a different thing that you didn't initially give them, then it's a lot easier to manage the individual group entity rather than all 50 users that are in the accounting group. And then on top of that, it's harder to manage who is and is not in accounting because there's not a good way of managing that without having a group entity. So users inherit permissions from the group, like I was stating before, and this is typically how you give access to people for network resources like file shares. All right. Permissions. Full control, modify, execute, read, and write. This is how Microsoft does it for them. Linux is done by a series of numbers or letters, which is typically read, write, and execute. A little bit simpler. They also don't have inheritance on their groups. So yeah, you add a user to a group in Linux, and that's kind of it. You don't have multiple layers to that, and which I find easier, but in Windows, if you find yourself that you need that for your use case, then Active Directory is the way to go for that. Okay, so again, like all the others, this is not intended for you to follow along. This is intended to show you what the process looks like before we actually go and physically do it. So we're going to create a group here, tools, Active Directory, users, and computers. We're going to come down here to users. That's a little counterintuitive. And then we're going to come up here and hit this icon here with the two people and the star. This is a new group. Okay. Domain local is used if you only have one domain. We only have one domain. When I went to create this, we were doing domain trust. So this is why it's on global. This should be on domain local for at least what we're trying to do. So we got a group name of Final Fantasy VIII. It's going to auto-populate your pre-2000s. And this is where we got to talk about security and distribution. Security is what you're going to end up using most of the time. Distribution is quite literally a distribution for a email. So Exchange server. Now, other than that, you're not going to be using distribution. Okay. And then here is the result for that. We have Final Fantasy VIII and then security group. Now we can actually go create a user, same place, tools, Active Directory, users, and computers. We go back to the users, and then we're going to use this icon instead of the multi-person icon. So we click on this. It's going to open up a little form for us. Obviously, if you're going to use real people, they're going to have first and last name. I am not doing that here, so I'm going to use the first name of Balthair. So first name, the full name is going to auto-populate. Login username, I'm going to still use Balthair, and then this is going to auto-populate with the domain that you have access to. We only have one, and we did finalfantasy.com, so this is going to auto-populate here, and then we're going to click next, and then password, and this is where you have the option for the user account itself. If you're doing something like an entity, the account can be disabled, or you can have the password that never expires. Not recommended, but you can do that. Depends on the use case. User cannot change password. Generally, you want the user to be able to change your password, but maybe you're in a government environment like I was in the Army where you couldn't change your password. Okay, and then user must change password on next login. This is typically used quite a bit, but because we have control over everything, so we would click this if we're actually in a Windows environment. In the real world, we would give a default password for whatever the company decided that default password was, and then we would make the user set their own password once they logged in, so we're not using default passwords everywhere. Okay, here we go, Balthair. And now we're going to add that new user to the group. So I skipped a step here, at least with the pictures, that I added another user here, and this is Fran. So these are both in a Final Fantasy 12, so we're going to add this to a group, and what we did here was made sure I had both of these active at the same time. If you don't know how to do that by shortcut, it's the control key, and then you can click both of those, add to group, and I right-clicked on those blue bars to get to this menu. Okay, we are going to enter the object name, which in this case is going to be the group. We're going to enter the group that we want to add this to, Final Fantasy, and then we're going to check names. And what this is going to do is auto-populate the ones that it actually matches with. So we needed Final Fantasy 12. Again, this is a step that I skipped because we did Final Fantasy 8 the first time, but it's the exact same process. So Final Fantasy 12, I'm going to click OK. Going to show properties on Final Fantasy 12. Okay, we got general. I'm going to go to members, and now we can see here that our members is both Balthair and Fran. So that's the end of the slideshow. Let's go ahead and do that ourselves. So minimize that. Again, same format as before. And we will do Final Fantasy 12. So over here, that's going to be group 2. So we will start over there. Okay, so we're going to come over here to tools. We're going to come down to users and computers. I'm going to open this up, users. We're going to need to make that group first. We're going to do Final Fantasy 12. Okay. Domain local, security. Okay, there's that. We're going to create a couple users now. Balthair. username is going to be, or at least the login username is Balthayer. Okay, next. Password. I'm not going to change that, and then I'm going to leave the rest of that blank because we have control. Okay, now the user. Okay, Fran. No, okay. All right, finish. Go find Fran, which is right there, and then Balthayer, which is right there. We're going to add these two to a group. Final Fantasy. So this is going to auto-populate because I don't have two Final Fantasy groups. It's going to auto-populate the Final Fantasy 12. Okay. Here we go. And now I'm going to go find the Final Fantasy group, which is right here. We're going to go to Properties, Members, and both Balthayer and Fran are in there, and I don't know what happened to that window. There it is. Okay, so Balthayer and Fran are both in there. So this is how you add users and groups. And we'll get into permissions more when we actually have permissions to give. So we'll be doing file sharing here shortly. What I'm going to end up doing is doing Final Fantasy VIII. So for good practice, go ahead and make your own group and your own users, and make sure that it's added to that group as well. So with that said, the next one, we're going to convert our Windows clients over here to enterprise login through the network Active Directory type of environment instead of what we're used to as consumers, as applying your account directly to the machine itself. So I will see you in the next one.